My parents loved only my golden brother, so they kicked me out of the house. My aunt helped me, and after a few years, I found a job and bought a house, which my parents tried to take away from me. Hi Reddit. I'm Amanda, 27F. I've been reading a lot of stories here, and it feels like the perfect place to finally unpack some of my own experiences. My childhood was complicated, to put it lightly. I grew up in a household where favoritism wasn't just a subtle undertone. It was practically the family motto. My parents, Joan and Michael, were artists. They weren't exactly the warm, nurturing type. They had made it clear, more than once, that kids weren't part of their original life plan. They wanted to travel, paint, and live free, as they often called it. Unfortunately for me, life didn't exactly align with their vision. When I was born, I was treated more like an inconvenience than a blessing. My mom would joke, half joking, half serious, that I'd ruined her body. I had such a perfect figure until you came along, Amanda, she'd say, laughing. I was always too embarrassed to know how to respond, especially when she'd say this in front of other people. My dad wasn't much better. He was the quiet type who would grumble if I cried too loudly or got in the way of his work. 5 years after I was born, my brother Jacob came into the picture, and that's when everything changed. Or maybe it's more accurate to say everything became clearer. Jacob was the golden child. I mean, if there were a shrine in our house, it would have been dedicated to him. From the moment he was born, he was showered with love and praise in a way I'd never experienced. My mom called him her miracle baby, and my dad would beam with pride anytime Jacob so much as sneezed. Meanwhile, I was in the background, trying not to be noticed, because being noticed usually meant being criticized. Jacob was everything I wasn't, according to my parents. Where I was clumsy, Jacob was graceful. Where I struggled to keep up in gym class, Jacob was a natural athlete. When I brought home a B+ on a math test, my mom would scoff, "Why not an A?" But when Jacob brought home a participation ribbon from a school art contest, it was framed and put on the living room wall. Even our physical appearances were treated differently. I had always been insecure about my looks, my braces, my frizzy brown hair, my awkward height, and my parents didn't help. My mom would make snide comments like, "You'd be so much prettier if you tried harder." Jacob, on the other hand, was adorable. His blonde hair and blue eyes were the pride of the family. "He's got the look of an angel," my dad said once. I'd never been so jealous of anyone in my life. It wasn't just the constant comparisons that hurt. It was the outright neglect. When I was 7, I entered a school writing contest and won first place. It was a big deal for me. I remember coming home, holding the certificate, practically vibrating with excitement. "That's nice, honey," my mom said without even looking up from her easel. She was working on one of her abstract pieces, Jacob's face in profile, naturally. My dad muttered something like, "Don't interrupt your mother when she's working." I went to my room and cried until dinner. Later that week, Jacob drew a stick figure family, and my parents hung it on the fridge like it was a Picasso. The neglect wasn't always emotional. Sometimes it was practical, too. My parents would forget things, important things, like the time I had a school play and they didn't show up. I was 10, and I'd worked so hard to memorize my lines. I kept scanning the audience, hoping to see them. They never came. When I got home, they said they'd lost track of time. It was a slap in the face when, 2 years later, they skipped an entire weekend trip because Jacob had a soccer game. The older I got, the worse it seemed. My teenage years were a nightmare. I was expected to babysit Jacob constantly, even when I had schoolwork or plans with friends. Once, I dared to tell my mom I couldn't watch him because I had a big science project due. She blew up at me, accusing me of being selfish. "We've given you everything, Amanda," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "And this is how you repay us?" For the record, everything apparently meant food and a roof over my head, because emotional support wasn't part of the deal. It wasn't just my parents either. Their favoritism extended to other relatives, too. At family gatherings, Jacob was the star of the show. Everyone wanted to hear about his latest accomplishments, his soccer trophies, his cute little school crushes. Me? I was lucky if anyone even remembered I was there. My grandma once gave Jacob a $100 bill for his birthday. When mine rolled around a few months later, she handed me a card with $5 and said, "You're a big girl now. You don't need much, do you?" Despite all this, I tried to be a good sister. I really did. But Jacob wasn't exactly grateful. He was spoiled and knew it. When I'd babysit him, he'd throw tantrums if I didn't let him have his way. Once, he broke one of my favorite necklaces, a gift from my best friend, and when I told him to apologize, he just laughed. "Mom says I don't have to listen to you," he said smugly. Of course, when I told my mom, she brushed it off. "He's just a kid, Amanda. Don't be so dramatic." Looking back, the worst part wasn't even the neglect or the blatant favoritism. It was how much I started to believe that I deserved it. I thought there was something wrong with me, something that made me less worthy of love. I spent years trying to be perfect, to get straight A's, to be quiet and obedient, to never ask for too much, hoping that maybe, just maybe, my parents would finally see me. They never did. There were moments when the resentment boiled over. One summer, when I was about 15 and Jacob was 10, we were at the park. He'd been whining about wanting ice cream, and I'd told him we'd get some after lunch. He screamed at me, calling me mean and stupid, and threw a stick at my leg. I snapped. I yelled at him, loud enough that people turned to stare. "You're such a brat, Jacob. The world doesn't revolve around you." I regretted it immediately. Not because I didn't mean it, but because of what happened when we got home. Jacob told my parents I'd been mean to him, and they sided with him, of course. My mom grounded me for a week, even after I explained what really happened. "You're older," she said. "You should know better." Hey Reddit, it's Amanda again. I wanted to share another chapter of my life that still feels surreal, even years later. After graduating high school at 19, I started school a bit late due to some family chaos. I was hit with something I never saw coming. A legal eviction notice. Yep, you read that right. My own parents, Joan and Michael, served me with papers to get out of the house. I remember the day vividly. I came home from my part-time job at the local diner, exhausted but relieved to have finished my last shift before starting community college. There, on the kitchen table, was an envelope with my name on it. Inside, a formal letter stated that I had 30 days to vacate the premises. My heart sank. I confronted my parents, hoping there was some mistake. My mom didn't even look up from her painting. "It's time for you to be independent, Amanda," she said, her tone as cold as the letter in my hand. My dad chimed in, "We've done our part. You're an adult now." I was stunned. Jacob, my 14-year-old brother, was lounging on the couch, earbuds in, completely oblivious, or maybe just indifferent, to the bombshell that had just been dropped. I couldn't understand how they could be so callous, especially when Jacob was still being coddled like a toddler. I had no savings, no plan, and nowhere to go. I spent the next few weeks frantically searching for an apartment, but without a steady income or a cosigner, no landlord would take a chance on me. I reached out to friends, but their parents weren't keen on taking in another teenager, especially one with no financial stability. As the eviction deadline loomed, panic set in. I remember sitting on the floor of my empty bedroom, the walls bare after I'd packed up my few belongings, feeling utterly abandoned. My parents didn't offer any help or advice. They simply watched as I struggled, as if this were some twisted rite of passage. On the day I was forced to leave, I loaded my meager possessions into a beat-up duffel bag and took the bus to the nearest shelter, 20 kilometers away from the only home I'd ever known. The shelter was a stark, cold building with flickering fluorescent lights and the constant hum of despair. I was assigned a cot in a large room filled with other women, each with their own stories of hardship. The first night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life had come to this. The days blurred together as I navigated the harsh realities of shelter life. The staff, though well-meaning, were overworked and underfunded. Meals were sparse, and privacy was non-existent. I had to keep a vigilant eye on my belongings, as theft was rampant. The shelter's location made it difficult to commute to the community college I'd enrolled in, and I soon realized that attending classes was a luxury I couldn't afford. I dropped out before the semester even began. One evening, as I returned to the shelter after a futile day of job hunting, I was approached by a woman named Lisa. She was in her early 30s, with a warm smile that stood in stark contrast to our bleak surroundings. "You look like you could use a friend," she said, handing me a cup of lukewarm coffee. We sat together in the common area, and I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with anyone else. Lisa had her own tale of betrayal. She'd been kicked out by a partner after years of emotional abuse. We bonded over our shared sense of abandonment and the struggle to rebuild our lives from nothing. Lisa introduced me to a small group of women who met regularly to support each other. There was Maria, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who had lost her home after a medical bankruptcy, and Tasha, a fiery 22-year-old who had aged out of the foster system with no safety net. These women became my lifeline, offering advice, resources, and, most importantly, a sense of belonging. Despite the camaraderie, shelter life was fraught with challenges. One night, a fight broke out between two residents over a missing jacket. The altercation escalated quickly, resulting in one woman being taken away by the police. The incident left me shaken, a stark reminder of the volatility that surrounded me. I knew I couldn't stay in the shelter indefinitely. I needed a plan. Drawing on the resilience I developed over years of neglect, I set small, achievable goals. First, I secured a job at a local grocery store, stocking shelves during the night shift. The work was grueling, and the pay was minimal, but it was a start. With Lisa's help, I learned about a transitional housing program that provided affordable rooms for young women trying to get back on their feet. After weeks of applications and interviews, I was accepted into the program and moved into a tiny, but private, room. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The stability of having my own space allowed me to focus on the future. I saved every penny I could, often skipping meals to put more money aside. I also took advantage of free counseling services offered by the housing program, where I began to unpack the trauma of my upbringing and the recent eviction. The counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, helped me understand that my parents' actions were a reflection of their own shortcomings, not my worth. As months turned into a year, I found myself growing stronger, both emotionally and financially. I enrolled in a vocational training program for medical billing and coding, a field with steady job prospects. The coursework was challenging, but I was determined to succeed. During this time, I received a letter from Jacob. It was unexpected, to say the least. He wrote about feeling suffocated by our parents' expectations and confessed that he envied my freedom, despite the hardships I faced. He apologized for not standing up for me and expressed a desire to reconnect. I was hesitant but agreed to meet him at a cafe in my old hometown. Seeing Jacob after all those months was surreal. He had grown taller, his face more angular, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there before. We talked for hours, sharing our experiences and fears. Jacob revealed that our parents had become even more controlling, pressuring him to pursue a career in the arts despite his passion for engineering. He felt trapped, much like I had. Our conversation opened a door to healing. We began to communicate regularly, offering each other the support we had both been denied by our parents. Jacob's insights into their current lives were eye-opening. Joan and Michael had faced social scrutiny for evicting me, leading to strained relationships within their social circle. It seemed their actions had consequences they hadn't anticipated. With time, I completed my vocational training and secured a job at a reputable healthcare company. The steady income allowed me to move into a modest apartment, a space that truly felt like home. I continued therapy with Dr. Patel, working through the lingering effects of my tumultuous upbringing. Jacob, inspired by my journey, found the courage to confront our parents about his own future. It wasn't easy, and there were many heated arguments, but eventually they relented, allowing him to apply to the engineering program he dreamed of. Our relationship with him remained strained, but Jacob and I found solace in our renewed sibling bond. Hi Reddit, it's Amanda again. After the chaos of being evicted and navigating the uncertainty of shelter life, I want to share the next chapter of my journey. This was the part where I slowly began to rebuild, thanks to a few unexpected allies, a lot of determination, and some moments that could have turned my life upside down. The shelter had been a tough environment, but it wasn't all bad. Among the constant noise and daily struggles, I found a small group of people who made the experience bearable. Lisa, who I mentioned earlier, became my closest friend. Her sharp humor and street smarts helped me navigate the unspoken rules of shelter life. There was also Tasha, the fiery young woman who'd grown up in the foster system, and Maria, whose quiet strength inspired me more than she realized. Together, we supported each other through sleepless nights and shared meals of canned soup and day-old bread. One evening, as we sat in the common room playing cards, Lisa asked a question that hit me like a ton of bricks. "So, what's your next move, Amanda? You can't stay here forever." It was a question I had been avoiding. Until that moment, survival had been my only focus. But Lisa was right. I needed a plan. That night, I stayed up late scribbling ideas in a notebook I'd scavenged from the shelter's donation bin. The next morning, I made a decision. I would reach out to my Aunt Susan. Susan was my dad's younger sister, and though we hadn't been particularly close, she'd always been kind to me during family gatherings. She lived in a small town 500 kilometers away and worked as a high school teacher. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but I had nothing to lose. With trembling hands, I borrowed the shelter's phone and dialed her number. "Hello?" Susan's voice was warm and familiar, but I could hear the surprise when I introduced myself. "Amanda? Oh my gosh, it's been ages. How are you?" she asked. The words spilled out before I could stop them. I told her everything: the eviction, the shelter, the hopelessness I felt. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I braced myself for rejection. Instead, Susan said, "Pack your things. I'll come get you." True to her word, Susan arrived 2 days later in her dusty blue Subaru. When she stepped out of the car, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked older, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were as kind as I remembered. She pulled me into a hug, and for the first time in months, I felt safe. The drive to Susan's house was long, but we filled the hours catching up. She told me about her life as a teacher and how she'd recently started fostering rescue dogs. I told her about my part-time jobs and my failed attempt at college. Susan listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully as I spoke. When we arrived, I was taken aback by how cozy her home was. It was a modest 2-bedroom house with walls lined with bookshelves and a fireplace that smelled faintly of cedar. Her 3 dogs, a golden retriever named Max, a mutt named Daisy, and a tiny terrier mix named Peanut, greeted us at the door with wagging tails. I felt a lump in my throat. This wasn't just a house, it was a home. Living with Susan was a turning point for me. She didn't just give me a roof over my head. She gave me a sense of stability I hadn't known in years. She set firm but loving boundaries, like insisting I contribute to household chores and stick to a schedule. It was exactly what I needed. With her help, I found a job at a large bookstore in town. It was a beautiful place, with tall shelves, cozy reading nooks, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the attached cafe. I started as a salesperson, shelving books and helping customers find what they were looking for. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. Being surrounded by books every day felt like a dream come true. At the bookstore, I met some incredible people who became an unexpected support system. There was Emma, the no-nonsense manager who ran the place like a well-oiled machine, and Kevin, a fellow employee with a passion for graphic novels and a knack for making everyone laugh. But the person who impacted me the most was a customer named Grace. Grace was a retired professor who came in every Tuesday to browse the philosophy section. She was sharp-witted and curious, always asking about my favorite books or what I wanted to do with my life. One day, after a particularly long conversation, she said something that stuck with me. "You're too bright to settle, Amanda. Have you ever thought about going back to school?" The idea of returning to university felt daunting, but Susan and Grace wouldn't let me dismiss it. Susan spent hours researching scholarships and grants with me, while Grace helped me draft application essays. I eventually applied to a nearby state university, focusing on a degree in literature, a subject I'd always loved but never thought I could pursue. Meanwhile, life with Susan wasn't without its challenges. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, there was an unexpected knock at the door. It was my dad. I hadn't seen him since the eviction, and the sight of him standing there, disheveled and uncomfortable, sent a wave of anger and sadness crashing over me. He claimed he'd come to make amends, but it quickly became clear he was more interested in defending his actions than apologizing. We did what we thought was best for you, he said, his voice laced with irritation. Susan, bless her, didn't hold back. Best for her? You threw her out like she was garbage, Michael. She's been through hell because of you. The argument escalated, and I ended up asking my dad to leave. As he walked away, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. It was a painful reminder that some relationships are better left in the past. Despite the occasional bumps, my time with Susan was transformative. I began to see myself in a new light, not as the unwanted daughter or the struggling shelter resident, but as someone with potential. I worked hard at the bookstore, saved money, and threw myself into preparing for university. On weekends, Susan and I would take the dogs for long hikes or curl up by the fireplace with mugs of hot chocolate, talking about everything from books to life lessons. When my acceptance letter arrived, I was in shock. I read it 3 times before the words fully registered. Susan cried when I told her, pulling me into a hug so tight it nearly knocked the wind out of me. I'm so proud of you, Amanda, she said, her voice thick with emotion. As I packed my bags for university, I felt a mix of excitement and fear. Starting over wasn't easy, but I knew I had the support of Susan, Grace, and the friends I'd made along the way. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was to have found people who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Susan's kindness, Grace's encouragement, and even the camaraderie of my shelter friends gave me the strength to keep going. I'll always be grateful for that chapter of my life, as painful and unpredictable as it was. It taught me that even in the darkest moments, there's a chance for something better. Hi Reddit, it's Amanda again. I wanted to share the time in my life when things finally started to feel stable, maybe for the first time ever. After being evicted by my parents and bouncing between shelters, my Aunt Susan became the person who gave me a chance to rebuild. Living with her was transformative, not just because of the roof over my head, but because she believed in me in a way no one else ever had. When I moved in with Susan, I had no clue what to expect. I was carrying a duffel bag of clothes, a few books, and years of emotional baggage. I thought she might treat me like a guest, someone to look after until I could stand on my own. But Susan was different. From day one, she made it clear that her home was my home too. Okay, first things first, she said as we unloaded my things from her car. We're going to set some ground rules, not because I don't trust you, but because I want this to work for both of us. Her rules weren't harsh. She asked me to help out with chores, be honest about my plans, and respect the space we shared. It was a conversation, not a lecture, and I was floored by how much she trusted me. This is about building your independence, she said. I'm here to help, but you're capable of so much more than you realize. One of the first things Susan did was sit me down at the kitchen table with a notebook, a calculator, and a stack of brochures. We're going to make a financial plan, she announced, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. I stared at her blankly. Financial planning was something I'd never thought about, let alone done. My parents had never taught me anything about managing money. They barely managed their own. Susan, on the other hand, was meticulous. She walked me through the basics, how to budget, save, and track expenses. She helped me open a bank account, showing me how to set up direct deposits for my bookstore job and explaining the importance of building credit. At first, it was overwhelming. I had no idea how much money I'd need for rent, food, or emergencies. But Susan broke it down into manageable steps. Start small, she said. Save what you can, even if it's just a few dollars a week. It adds up. Every week, we'd sit down together and review my progress. She never judged me for missteps, like the time I blew half my paycheck on clothes I didn't need. Instead, she helped me understand my mistakes and find ways to do better. For the first time, I felt like I had control over my life, or at least a part of it. Living with Susan wasn't just about learning practical skills. She also treated me like an equal, which was something I'd never experienced before. She trusted me with important tasks, like taking care of her dogs or organizing her classroom materials. I remember one weekend when she had to attend a teaching conference out of state. She left me in charge of the house, the dogs, and even her small garden. Think you can handle it? She asked with a teasing smile. I'll do my best, I replied, secretly terrified I'd mess everything up. But I didn't. The weekend went smoothly, and when she came home, the house was spotless, the dogs were happy, and the plants were thriving. Susan hugged me and said, "See? I knew you could do it." That moment might seem small, but it was monumental for me. My parents had never trusted me with anything, always assuming I'd screw it up. Susan's faith in me was like a lifeline, pulling me out of the self-doubt that had defined my life for so long. One of the most surprising things about living with Susan was how she supported my dreams. I'd always loved reading and writing, but my parents had dismissed those interests as hobbies at best and wastes of time at worst. Susan, however, encouraged me to pursue them. She took an interest in my writing, reading my short stories and offering thoughtful feedback. "You have a gift," she told me. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." It wasn't just words either. Susan actively helped me find ways to grow. She introduced me to a local writers group that met at the library every Thursday evening. At first, I was hesitant to join. The idea of sharing my work with strangers was terrifying. But Susan nudged me gently. "You don't have to share anything until you're ready," she said. "Just go and listen. See what it's like." The group turned out to be a revelation. It was filled with people from all walks of life: students, retirees, stay-at-home parents, who all shared a passion for storytelling. Their encouragement gave me the confidence to submit a short story to a local literary magazine. When it got published, Susan threw a little celebration at home, complete with a cake that said, "Published author," in bright blue icing. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. There were moments of tension, especially when it came to my parents. They didn't reach out often, but when they did, it always threw me off balance. One night, my mom called out of the blue, her voice dripping with faux concern. "How are you, Amanda? Are you doing okay?" I didn't buy it for a second. She wasn't calling to check on me. She was fishing for gossip to share with her friends. When I told her about living with Susan, she made a snide remark about how I was taking advantage of her generosity. Susan overheard the conversation and stepped in after I hung up. "You don't owe them anything," she said firmly. "They made their choices, and you're making yours. Don't let them guilt you into thinking otherwise." Her support gave me the strength to set boundaries with my parents, something I'd never been able to do before. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for my own well-being. The most transformative part of living with Susan was the sense of security she provided. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't constantly walking on eggshells, waiting for the next criticism or punishment. Susan believed in me, and that belief was contagious. It made me start believing in myself. I remember one evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Susan turned to me and said, "You've come a long way, Amanda. I hope you're proud of yourself, because I sure am." I didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said those words to me before. But as I looked around, at the dogs curled up at our feet, at the tidy house we'd worked together to maintain, at the bank statements showing my growing savings, I realized she was right. I had come a long way, and for the first time, I felt like my future was something I could shape, not just survive. Living with Susan was more than a chapter in my life. It was a turning point. She taught me how to stand on my own 2 feet while making sure I knew I didn't have to do it alone. Her guidance, trust, and unwavering support changed everything for me. I'll always be grateful for the time we spent together and the lessons she taught me, not just about independence, but about the kind of person I want to be. Hi Reddit, it's Amanda again. This time, I'm going to talk about one of the most shocking and infuriating chapters of my life. The time my parents, Joan and Michael, tried to bulldoze their way back into my life after years of neglect and abuse. Their audacity still blows my mind. By this point, I had worked tirelessly to build a life for myself. With Susan's guidance, I had gone to university, earned a degree in literature, and saved up enough money to buy a modest house in a quiet town. The house was nothing fancy, but it was mine, a symbol of how far I'd come. I bought it with a mix of savings and a surprise windfall, $200,000 I'd received after selling a book I'd written based on my experiences of survival and growth. The sale was unexpected and overwhelming, but it allowed me to put down roots and truly feel independent. Jacob, now 18, was still living with our parents, and our relationship had grown stronger over the years. He had started reaching out to me more frequently, and I could sense that he was beginning to understand what I'd endured. During one of our phone calls, he told me about the pressure our parents were putting on him. "They're trying to make me pay for everything. Amanda," he said, frustration clear in his voice. "Dad's asking me for money for the mortgage, and Mom wants me to cover her art supplies. I'm just trying to save up for college." I wasn't surprised. Joan and Michael had always been financially reckless, prioritizing their artistic passions over stability. I tried to comfort Jacob, advising him to set boundaries and not let them guilt-trip him into financing their lifestyle. But I could tell he felt trapped, much like I had at his age. The trouble started with letters. At first, they were sporadic, a few awkwardly phrased notes apologizing for the misunderstandings of the past and hinting that they'd love to reconnect. I didn't respond. Then the tone shifted. The letters became more demanding, with phrases like, "You owe us for raising you," and "Family is supposed to stick together." One letter in particular made my blood boil. It read, "We heard about the money you made from your book. Congratulations. Since you wouldn't be where you are without us, it's only fair that you share the wealth. Selling your house and giving us our share would be a good start." I couldn't believe their audacity. These were the same people who had thrown me out of their house without a second thought, and now they were acting like I owed them something. I tore up the letter and threw it in the trash, but the anger lingered. Then came the phone calls. At first, I ignored them, but one evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. It was my mom. "Amanda, honey, we just want to talk," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "We've been struggling, and we thought you could help. It's what families do, right?" I couldn't hold back. "You mean like how you helped me by kicking me out with nowhere to go?" I shot back. "Or how you ignored me for years while doting on Jacob?" Her tone shifted immediately. The sweetness evaporated, replaced by irritation. "That was a long time ago, Amanda. Stop living in the past. We're your parents, and we need your help." I hung up, but the calls kept coming, sometimes from my dad, other times from numbers I didn't recognize. I blocked them all, but it didn't stop them. I started to feel like I was being stalked. The final straw came when they showed up at my house unannounced. It was a Saturday morning, and I was in the backyard tending to my small garden when I heard the rumble of a truck pulling into my driveway. I walked around to the front and froze. There they were, Joan and Michael, standing next to an old moving truck filled with furniture and boxes. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "We're moving in," my dad said matter-of-factly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "We figured it's time we all lived together again." I was stunned. "You can't just decide to move into my house. This isn't your home." My mom crossed her arms, her face set in that smug, condescending expression I knew so well. "We're your parents, Amanda. We have every right to be here. Besides, you have plenty of room." I was shaking with rage. "Get off my property," I said, my voice louder now. "I'm serious. You're trespassing." They ignored me and started unloading the truck. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. They were really going to do this. I pulled out my phone and called the police. When the officers arrived, I explained the situation as calmly as I could, though my voice wavered with anger and frustration. Joan and Michael tried to spin their own version of the story, claiming they had every right to move in because they were family. But the officers weren't buying it. "Ma'am, do you have any proof of ownership for this property?" one of them asked me. I quickly retrieved the deed from my filing cabinet, showing them that the house was in my name and mine alone. That was enough to settle the matter. The officers informed my parents that they had no legal right to be there and instructed them to leave immediately. As they packed up the truck, my mom turned to me with a glare that could have cut glass. "You'll regret this, Amanda. Don't think we'll forget how you treated us." I didn't respond. I just stood there, watching as they drove away. When the truck disappeared down the street, I finally allowed myself to breathe. But the sense of violation lingered. After that incident, I decided to take extra precautions. I installed security cameras around the property and changed my phone number. I also reached out to Jacob, who was horrified when I told him what had happened. "I can't believe they did that," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I'm so sorry, Amanda. I should have warned you. They've been talking about you a lot lately, saying how ungrateful you are. It's not your fault, I assured him. But you need to be careful, Jacob. Don't let them manipulate you. We talked for hours that night, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in dealing with our parents' toxic behavior. Jacob was starting to see them for who they really were, and it gave me a sense of validation I hadn't realized I needed. In the weeks that followed, my parents continued to try and contact me, but their efforts became increasingly desperate. At one point, they even tried to guilt-trip Susan, calling her and accusing her of turning me against them. Susan, of course, didn't buy into their nonsense. She told them in no uncertain terms to leave me alone and hung up. Their antics only solidified my resolve. I had worked too hard to let them drag me back into their chaos. This was my life now, one I had built with blood, sweat, and tears, and I wasn't about to let them take it away from me. Looking back, their attempts to reinsert themselves into my life were both infuriating and pathetic. They thought they could manipulate me like they always had, but they underestimated how much I'd grown. I'm proud of the boundaries I set and the strength I found to enforce them. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. To anyone out there dealing with toxic family members, you don't owe them anything, no matter what they try to make you believe. Protect your peace. It's worth it. Hi Reddit, it's Amanda again. This is the chapter where everything truly changed, where I finally broke free from the manipulation of my parents, Joan and Michael, and began to live the life I'd always deserved. After years of their toxicity, it was a turning point I didn't know I needed as much as I did. The months following their failed attempt to move into my house were eerily quiet. For a while, I thought they might have finally given up. Jacob occasionally updated me about their antics. He was still living with them at the time, struggling to set boundaries while trying to save money for college. "They're still bitter about you calling the cops," he said during one of our phone calls. "Mom keeps saying you've turned into a selfish, ungrateful daughter." I'd be lying if I said those words didn't sting, but I'd built up enough resilience to brush them off. My priority was maintaining my peace, and if that meant being the bad guy in their narrative, so be it. Then, one day, Jacob called with surprising news. "They're moving," he said. "Mom inherited that old house from Grandma in Wisconsin, and they're planning to live there." I was stunned. My grandmother's house was a crumbling relic in a tiny town with a population smaller than my college lecture hall. It had been in the family for generations, but no one wanted it because of the repairs it desperately needed. For Joan and Michael, though, it was a lifeline. They were running out of money and options, and the house was free. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this move was more about escaping the consequences of their actions than starting fresh. Their departure felt surreal. After years of looming over my life like a dark cloud, they were finally gone. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but what I actually felt was relief, an overwhelming sense of freedom that I hadn't realized was possible. For the first time, I didn't have to look over my shoulder, wondering when they'd show up unannounced or what guilt-laden message they'd send next. Jacob, however, wasn't as fortunate. He chose to stay behind, refusing to move to Wisconsin with them. "I can't live like this anymore," he told me. "I love them, but they're suffocating me." He found a small apartment with the help of some friends, but the fallout was brutal. Joan and Michael accused him of abandoning them, guilt-tripping him with messages like, "You're all we have left, and how could you do this to your family?" I could hear the exhaustion in his voice during our calls. He was trying so hard to stand his ground, but years of manipulation had taken their toll. Slowly, I began to support Jacob in the way I wished someone had supported me when I was his age. I reassured him that his feelings were valid, that setting boundaries didn't make him a bad person. It wasn't easy, but I could see him starting to believe it. One day, he called me sounding lighter than I'd heard him in months. "Amanda, I've been accepted into a trade program for engineering," he said. "It's part-time, but it's a start." I couldn't have been prouder. Jacob was finally taking steps toward a life that was his own, free from our parents' influence. He even began seeing a therapist, something he said was inspired by my own journey with counseling. We started meeting up more often, grabbing coffee or lunch whenever our schedules allowed. Those moments were healing for both of us, a chance to rebuild the sibling bond that had been strained for so long. Meanwhile, I focused on building my own life. I was still working at the bookstore, a place that had become like a second home to me. Emma, the manager, had promoted me to a senior position, and I was helping train new employees, a role I found surprisingly fulfilling. My coworkers had become like family, each of them bringing something unique to our little team. Kevin, with his endless jokes, kept us all laughing, while Grace, the retired professor, continued to mentor me, pushing me to aim higher in everything I did. It wasn't just work that kept me busy. I was now a senior at university, juggling classes, assignments, and part-time work. The days were long and exhausting, but every time I looked at the life I'd built, I knew it was worth it. Susan remained my rock, always there with advice, encouragement, or a warm meal when I needed it most. The final break with my parents came in the form of an envelope. It was a letter from Joan, written in her familiar scrawl, full of apologies that felt more like excuses. She blamed her behavior on stress, on financial troubles, on everything except herself. The letter ended with a plea. Please forgive us and let us back into your life. We're family, Amanda. That has to count for something. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. For years, I'd held on to the hope that they might change, that one day they'd wake up and realize the pain they'd caused. But that hope had only kept me chained to their dysfunction. Letting go of it was liberating. My life now is something I couldn't have imagined during those dark days in the shelter. I'm 28, a senior at university, and on track to graduate with honors. I'm still working at the bookstore, but I've started exploring career options in publishing, a field that combines my love of books with my growing confidence in my abilities. Susan continues to be my greatest supporter, cheering me on at every milestone. She even helped me celebrate my first official publication, a short story in a national magazine. We hosted a small gathering at her house, complete with champagne and homemade cupcakes. It was a moment I'll never forget. Jacob and I have grown closer than ever. He's thriving in his engineering program and recently landed an internship with a local firm. Seeing him come into his own has been one of the most rewarding parts of my journey. We talk regularly, sharing our successes and struggles, and I know we'll always have each other's backs. As for my parents, they've faded into the background of my life. Occasionally, I hear about them through distant relatives or the rare message from Jacob, but they no longer hold any power over me. Their absence has allowed me to fully embrace the people who truly matter. Susan, my friends, my coworkers, and, most importantly, myself.